with mathematical precision, something that only became possible after Ramsden's invention of the modern theodolite in 1787. How did the authors know that this was the boundary line, the precise location, the elevation? They rarely tell us. And yet most of us find maps convincing. They show us what we cannot see ourselves, and it is only when we actually check the truth on the ground or research historical records that we discover mistakes and misrepresentations. Second, there are many ways to depict spatial features, and the cartographer's choices draw our attention to certain ways and not other ways of seeing. Their choices can deceive us in many ways, as Marc Monmouillet's How to Lie with Maps demonstrates. We live in an age where there is a flood of accessible information. Modern scholarship needs to recognize this and consider ways in which the data underlying analysis is made available to the reader. This applies to the creation of modern historical atlases as well. I would say it applies to historical atlases in particular. What purposes do historical atlases serve? The common use of an historical atlas is as a reference work, of course. I have seen many examples of talks that take a page from an historical atlas and write some information on top of it, such as this. But some atlases are meant to be read through. John Mann's Atlas of the Year 1000, for example, is an example of an atlas with an argument that around then the major parts of the old world became interconnected in new ways. We can use an historical atlas to see the situation at the moment in the past, but the point of an historical atlas is that it is a collection of maps. We can use that collection to see changes in geographic information over time. This is a point I want to dwell on. I propose that we think of historical atlases as a means to achieve a higher pedagogical goal, teaching spatio-temporal thinking, teaching people to synthesize historical and geographical things. Why is it that the historical and the geographical are so hard to bring together? Alan Baker subtitles his book, Bridging the Divide, suggesting a problem. The answer, I think, is that history thinks in terms of changes over time, but it is very weak on seeing how this varies across space. And geography thinks in terms of variation across space, but is weak on tracking changes over time. There's good reason for this. It is hard to manage the amounts of information that are required, even assuming that the information is available in the first place. One reason history has so often been written as a history of the struggle for power is that the study of the past pays closer attention to those events that have consequences for the most people. How could we ever write a history that took everybody into account? This is, I think, a problem of scale. A national roadmap that is truly to scale would not be useful at all, since all roads would be invisible unless the map was so large that it was no longer useful. So too with history. We have to choose a time scale that allows us to summarize events and focus attention on those that have the greatest consequences. And how would it be possible for geographers to create a map that represented all change over time? At what scale could they do so? Yet a historical atlas sets out to do exactly this, to help us see change over time taking place through space. This is true to reality itself. It unfolds along the axes of space and time. We are always somewhere in space, somewhere in time. I do not think we have been particularly successful in making historical atlases serve this pedagogical goal, but then I don't think we have tried to do so either. I think the pedagogical goal is important because it provides a foundation for understanding how the world came to be as it is. 3. What principles should guide such a project? Let me propose that the principles that should guide the historical atlas are the ability to accomplish 3 purposes. First, it should be a reliable reference work that is built for the new expectations of the modern information age. That is, it should make it possible for users to access the raw data and the reasoning that makes for an historical atlas. Second, the historical atlas should say something. In fact, it should be capable of saying many things. In other words, the atlas should be something that informs about important changes that have taken place across space and time, and is thus inherently a work of historical and geographic interpretation. An atlas is interpreted, makes choices about what kinds of data it includes, and the cartographic techniques it uses to illustrate and highlight the correlations the atlas makers see between different data layers. Because it is interpreted, it ought to give the users the ability to test alternative informations of the data and look to other correlations. I'll give you one example here of the civil service examination in China, and rather arbitrarily setting the divisions of those places that produce between 1 and 50 and 51 100 degree holders. And you see that we're really talking largely about the eastern seacoast, and with three actually major centers. All we have to do is to redesign that to show different distributions, and we start to think very differently about the historical phenomena, the geographic distribution of the historical phenomena. You will have noticed that I'm pushing this discussion towards a certain conclusion, that a modern historical atlas will be interactive. It will give the users the ability to manipulate the data. This is related to my third principle. My third principle, a principle that in fact can encompass the previous two. An historical atlas that encourages users to think spatio-temporally in terms of space and time is one that makes active learning possible. Active learning means that the learner acquiring knowledge and skill by being actively engaged in the subject rather than by passively reading and listening. The learner needs to do more than open a book and look at a page. The learner needs to be involved in creating and what is on the page and interpreting it. He or she must do things and think about what he or she is doing. Learning science has shown that the active learner is a better learner. All the ways in which we assess learning. An historical atlas that enabled active learning to teach the learner how to represent the data, as well as providing a reference point. This may seem a tall demand for an historical atlas, but we are already capable of making such an atlas. In fact, if all we wanted to do was use modern methods to create a printed atlas that could serve as a reference work and be interesting to read and interpretive, we would have to do almost everything necessary to create an historical atlas for online learning. The technology to accomplish this is already common in the world of geography and is gaining ever more attention from historians. So what is the role of technology in creating an historical atlas? Geographic information system technology is a recent development from an historian's point of view, with commercial availability since the 1980s. It is a system designed to capture, store, manipulate, analyze, manage, and present all types of spatial or geographic data. The idea behind GIS is simple. Many different kinds of information include place as a variable or an attribute. Birth and death, sickness, business, taxes, accidents, air quality, religion. The census is the preeminent example of how information about individuals can be tied to places of residence at a very high degree of granularity. Very high degree of granularity. I'm sure that most of you are well acquainted with GIS, but for those of you who are not, let me say a few things about its key features. The most important thing is to understand the contrast with the printed map. In this example, a printed map puts together several kinds of information: the terrain of mountains, rivers, plains, the communications networks of roads, the location and names of villages and towns, and administrative boundaries. Now let us see what happens when we do this with the GIS. We're going to divide our information into layers, different kinds of layers, and we're going to create a database with attributes. Now, the first part is we're going to use a digital elevation model. This consists of grid data, in which every pixel has a value, colored in this case to reflect differences in elevation. The scale here is 1 to a million. There are better models for China. This is 1 to 250,000, created from paper maps, Russian paper maps. But none of the DEM we can download is as good as the online base maps and terrain models from Google and others. Our terrain model is what might be called, is a form of what is called raster data. But we can add another kind of data called vector. Points, lines, and polygons, where each point has a location on the x and y axes, and x and y axes represent longitude and latitude. Examples: this, points, lines, and polygons, placed with points on top of the DAM, to which we've added rivers, right? And that, in effect, is what we call a true GIS. We have terrain, we have lines, points, and polygons, but to specify what these mean, we have to create a database that defines the attributes of our spatial objects. Thus, for example, the polygons can be prefectures with their names and the other kind of data we wanted to attribute to them, such as population, or land use, and changes in land use over time. You can see immediately the flexibility this gives us. We can choose what to highlight according to our interests, but you can also see, and more importantly, that GIS allows us to measure the correlations between different kinds of data. For example, where the prefectural seats are relative to rivers. GIS software gives us control over symbology and analysis. Finally, with GIS, we can keep the individual data points and the aggregations. I know cartographers I know begin with GIS. They may export the GIS to map to software such as Adobe Illustrator for further refinements and better control over visual effects. Nevertheless, professional geographers and cartographers have done amazingly good maps with GIS. In fact, if we look at the Korean historical atlases, we can see that. It should be clear that I think GIS can play a key role in creating a modern historical atlas. In the first place, where am I now? Let's see. Okay, missing the slide here. In the first place, it allows us to keep the source information used for creating the layers that go into a map accessible, and thus meets the standards of a reference work appropriate for information age. Second, it makes it very easy to create maps that illustrate an interpretive point, or discovering the data so that the atlas can tell stories. Third, it has the potential to allow users active involvement in data symbolization and analysis, and thus becomes a means for encouraging active learning and spatio-temporal thinking. Now, creating an historical atlas, we would need to have attribute data in tables that can be uploaded to our GIS and then synchronized. I have some examples of this based on my own research. Luckily, in my own research, I have access to the China Historical GIS, which gives me information on the location of places in the administrative hierarchy of China from 221 BC to 1911, and the China Biographical Database, which gives me data on the careers and relationships of, at this point, 380,000 historical persons. But we need more than that. We need to have a way to disseminate our historical atlases so that these features of modern information and pedagogy are preserved. I expect it will not surprise you when I say that I do not think an historical atlas printed on paper can accomplish this. But there are some challenges we have to meet along the way. And these, again, are examples of the sorts of things that I've been interested in, using China Historical GIS and the China Biographical Database, where we have various ways of representing our data. And to reiterate that point, that historical online utilities for creating an historical atlas are, in fact, in my view, preferable to the expensive printed work. So what are the challenges in creating an historical GIS? Let me turn to this. Let me speak to this from the experiences we had of creating the China Historical GIS. When we began the China Historical GIS project, we began with a certain set of assumptions, not all of which have been proven right. First, we thought that a geographic perspective on China requires, in the first place, that we be able to locate the places that were mentioned in historical sources. Thus, we needed to discover where those places were and when they existed in that particular capacity. Places move. By this I mean the administrative seat of a county or prefecture may move, although the town itself may not, so that one has to know when the county seat was located in a certain place. This assumption was, of course, correct. In order to do this accurately, we needed to create a time series rather than slices of time. This would allow us to trace changes in the field administration from 221 BC to 1911 and match historical events with greater accuracy. Although in principle this is true, we were wrong to assume that the historical sources necessary to create a time series were adequate. We had to scale back our scope both spatially and temporally. We reduced our spatial scope to the core provinces of China, the 18 core provinces, because there was the lack of information on the vast frontier areas that at various points belonged to imperial dynasties. This was not a major problem since the area we covered still had 90% of the Chinese population. But we also had to reduce our temporal scope as it became clear that there was simply inadequate information to determine administrative changes for all periods. In particular, periods such as between the Han Dynasty and the Sui Dynasty, between 220 AD and 589, where there were multiple hostile states, lacked adequate administrative geography. Third, we faced the choices of how to represent administrative geography. For much of Chinese history, the basic structure is that counties belong to prefectures and prefectures belong to provinces. We could use these points to represent administrative seats, but since administrative units represented areas, there was a great desire to use polygons, as you see here as well. In the end, we decided to use points for county seats and polygons for prefectures and above, with the exception of 1911. But determining the border of prefectures was very, very time-consuming, and their reliability for earlier periods was open to question and created false certainty. I think it can still be argued that increasing the number of points by including known towns would be adequate and, in fact, a more reliable way of giving people a sense of the administrative order rather than using polygons. We saw our work as creating a common, fundamental GIS on which scholars could build their own specific projects and share their data sets with others. We thought all we had to do was provide the basic GIS data sets that researchers would then use them. Some did, but in fact, very few of our prospective users had any experience with GIS software. That situation has improved very, very gradually as access to training has increased. But we have not yet truly transformed the way scholars use spatial information. The The last point is that we know that creating an historical GIS requires scholars with expert knowledge of history, expert knowledge of historical geography. The Center for Chinese Historical Geography at Fudan University was able to bring a number of senior scholars with experience in historical cartography out of retirement to help. But we greatly underestimated the amount of time necessary to do this work. What began as a 3-year project soon stretched to many more years. This required new funding, a warning to you, President Kim. This required new funding, which we were sometimes able to obtain, but it also required new researchers as the elders decided to retire permanently. And unfortunately, younger scholars are pressed to publish their own work and are less inclined to spend time contributing to what is fundamentally an infrastructural project. This 3-year project to create an historical Chinese GIS for Chinese history is now in its 16th year and is still not finished. My last point. What is the role of technology in disseminating historical atlas? Using GIS to create the basis for a historical atlas is, I think, necessary. But how do we create an interactive user experience with analytic potential, make accessible the evidence for the basic administrative facts being depicted, and make accessible the data sets for thematic maps? If a printed historical atlas cannot do this, how can we accomplish these goals online? Let us consider 3 elements: a repository for existing printed historical maps, a gazetteer dataset archive, and an interactive thematic map collection. Historical maps online, old maps online, is an example of how an online map repository can be built. It includes thousands of geo-rectified historical maps from the major map collections in the US, Great Britain, and Europe. We need to make this repository for East Asian libraries as well. But this will require creating a multilingual interface rather than relying only on an English language interface. An online historical gazetteer is useful independently of an historical atlas. The gazetteer search engine of the China Historical GIS is widely and constantly used by scholars around the world. They use it to discover the location and history of historical places. This is how the evidence and reasoning behind the historical points and polygons can be made accessible to the user. Finally, my last example, World Map now provides a mechanism for, this again is a dataset archive. In this case, is for the China Historical GIS, where all users are free at no cost to download all the data sets for educational use. Finally, we need an interactive thematic map collection. And this is created by World Map, which now provides a mechanism for disseminating interactive thematic maps. As of May 2016, World Map had 16,800 registered users, 27,000 data layers added by users, and over 6,000 map collections, with 1.5 million unique visitors and about 1,000 visitors per day. World Map, developed at Harvard, is open source. Anyone may use World Map, may download source code, set up their own instance, close it to the world if they want to, or open it to the world if they choose. Here are some examples of how we have used World Map to begin to create an historical atlas, a new kind of historical atlas for China, which you see here. There are 142 map collections on China in World Map. I've just chosen the ones here on your right, which are for a course in Chinese history, where we can take information from various periods, give users the opportunity to choose what they want to see, begin to look across different periods, and this actually gives us enormous capabilities to go from antiquity into the present. In this case, you're looking at migration, internal migration within China. This is a new and open-ended future for historical atlases. And with this conference and the many speakers and experts we have today, and I admit that they are far more expert on historical atlases than I am, I recognize that, I look forward to learning more from you. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다. 피터블 교수님께서 역사학과 지리학 그리고 지도 제작 나아가서 교육용 교재 개발의 상관성에 대해서 중국의 사례를 들어서 잘 요약해 주셨습니다. 다시 한번 대단히 감사드립니다. 네, 이제 오전 세션 시작 전에